Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Before I get started, I just want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. I hope you all enjoyed time with your families. But I just want to spend a few minutes talking to you all today about something that's going on in Minneapolis. As I pointed out in one of my prior videos, members of Black Lives Matter, the NAACP, and other civil rights organizations have been protesting outside of the 4th District Precinct, demanding justice for Jamar Clark. Jamar Clark was a 24-year-old African American man who was killed by police on November 15th. The brother was unarmed, and according to some witnesses, this brother was handcuffed at the time when he was shot by the police. And apparently there is video footage of this shooting. So the people have been protesting outside of the precinct, demanding justice for this brother, demanding access to the videotape, demanding that the videotape be released to the public. So while the people have been protesting, hate groups have been organizing as well. As I mentioned in the other tape, 2 members of a hate group, or some white supremacists, were in a car and they videotaped themselves. And in the videotape, they use racial slurs. One of them brandishes a gun, and they talk about going to Minneapolis to monitor the protest there. And essentially, these guys are threatening black protesters in that videotape. So while the people are protesting, a group of white supremacists arrive at the scene. These white supremacists have their faces covered with masks, so no one can identify them. So members of the Black Lives Matter movement asked them to remove their masks, and since these white supremacists weren't willing to comply, members of Black Lives Matter tried to move these white supremacists away from the site of the protest. So as they move these hate mongers away, these racists away, the racists pull out guns and begin to fire upon Black Lives members. They shoot 5 members, injuring them. And according to news reports, the injuries were non-life threatening. And Wednesday, 4 of the suspects were arrested. All of them are white. There was a Hispanic who was detained as well at one point, but he was released after being questioned by the police. And I will provide links in the description box to the New York Times article that provides more details. Also, I will include a link to my recent blog post about this issue as well. So you have 4 people in custody right now, 4 white men. One of the white men who are in custody actually appeared in that videotape, and his name is Lance Scarsella. He is the one who was seated in the passenger seat in the video. And again, I will include a link to that video as well so that you can see it for yourself. But these people are under arrest, and that's a positive development. If they are the ones responsible for the shooting, they should be punished to the full extent of the law. I hope that they are punished. But the story doesn't really end right there, because I saw a couple of interviews. I saw an interview with a member of the NAACP, and I also saw an interview on Democracy Now! With one of the members of Black Lives Matter, and this person is also a member of the Black Law Students Association, and her name is Leslie Redmond. She appeared on Democracy Now! And she raised some questions, and she suggested that perhaps the police were behind this disruption or this shooting of Black Lives Matter members. She points out how even though this shooting occurred just down the street from the police department, it took the police an unusual amount of time to arrive on the scene. Also, she pointed out how when the police finally arrived, instead of immediately questioning witnesses to this shooting, these police began to mace the protesters and even some of the witnesses. She also pointed out how the police wore the exact same mask over their face as these white supremacists wore. And she talked about how masked police were monitoring the events, monitoring the protests. And there's actually video footage of a member of the police union talking about the need to break up this protest, the need to end the protest. And what better way to end a protest than to shoot some members and scare people off? So all of these facts cause members of the organizations to question whether or not the police had some involvement in this shooting. And that's a very serious question that deserves to be thoroughly investigated by the Justice Department. Right now, the Justice Department is investigating the shooting of Jamar Clark, but they also need to investigate the Minneapolis Police Department for its practices, and they also need to investigate them in regards to this shooting, because there are serious questions raised here. Questions that point to the possibility that perhaps the police knew something about this shooting ahead of time or had some kind of knowledge of it, or failed to act despite threats against protesters. Because for quite some time there had been threats against these protesters. There had been threats on their lives. There had been video messages that were threatening, and the police failed to act. They failed to act. And on the Democracy Now! Interview, and I will include a link to that as well so you can watch that, the members of Black Lives Matter, they expressed their complete lack of faith in the police department. They talked about how they had zero confidence in the police being able to provide any kind of protection to the protesters. You know, they talked about how the protesters were beat with batons, sprayed with mace. And again, these police officers had the same kind of mask as these white supremacists had on. And those things raise questions. They raise serious questions that need to be answered. There was a time when you really couldn't tell the police from the KKK. At night, the police wore those KKK hoods. During the day, they had on their badges. And hopefully, we haven't returned to that era where the white supremacists and the police are one and the same. One thing that I want to point out as well is how, you know, during this interview on Democracy Now!, Leslie Redmond was talking about how courageous those young black men were who escorted these white supremacists away from the area. She pointed out how if those white supremacists just opened fire on the crowd, many more people could have been injured or even killed. She mentioned that there was a child in that audience or amongst the protesters who could have been injured. See, these people don't want us to stand up for our rights. And when you can't depend on the police for protection, that's when it's time for you to protect yourselves. I understand the role of nonviolence. I understand the importance of nonviolence, but I also understand the importance of self-defense. And there needs to be an armed presence at these protests. We need people who are licensed to carry arms to protect the protesters. People who are prepared to deal with white supremacists, who are prepared to respond to the threats of these white supremacists. Because obviously the police are not prepared, or they're not concerned about the threat that those groups pose to demonstrators. So it's time for us to protect ourselves. And there's one other point that I wanted to mention. During her interview on Democracy Now!, Leslie Redmond also mentioned that the people who were shot, the Black Lives Matter demonstrators who were shot, were some of the people who were at the front lines. Some of the people who were confronting and arguing with the police. So the fact that those people were the ones who were targeted, that's also a weird coincidence. Something that needs to be addressed in an investigation. We can't even rely on this police department to protect the protesters. So we obviously can't rely on them to conduct a fair and complete investigation. So I really hope that, the Justice Department investigates this police department to find out if they were involved in this shooting.